It began with a sound no one could quite describe. Something between a heartbeat and a knock, echoing from beneath the Whitlock farmhouse in Delaware, 1846. The neighbors said the Whitlocks were blessed that year, for all three of the men's wives were expecting, and the old family home buzzed with new life. But it wasn't the laughter of mothers-to-be that drifted through the trees at night. It was something else. Low, rhythmic, like breath being held too long. People whispered that the pregnancies were strange. The women never left the house, never attended church, never sent for supplies themselves. When the town midwife was finally summoned, she ran from that place before the night ended, shaking and drenched in sweat, mumbling about hearing crying from underground. By the time anyone dared return, the Whitlock doors were locked and the windows nailed shut from the inside. No one saw the wives again. No one saw any children either. Yet for years after, when the fog rolled in thick over the Delaware fields, locals swore they could still hear faint sobbing beneath the soil, like unborn voices calling for the mothers who were never meant to live. In the quiet farmlands of Delaware, 1846, the Whitlock family lived on the edge of the woods where the fog lingered even in daylight, and the ground stayed damp long after rain. The family was respected, though not well known beyond the nearest town of Milford. There were three Whitlock brothers, Thomas, Elias, and Jonah, each with a wife who kept mostly to the home, attending church only when necessary and rarely joining the town gatherings. When word spread that all three Whitlock wives were with child, people took it as a blessing, a sign that the land was finally favoring the family that had long been cursed with stillbirths and sickness. It was the kind of news that should have brought joy, yet the way the Whitlocks spoke of it made even the faithful uneasy. Thomas, the eldest, announced it in the local tavern one cold evening, his voice low and deliberate, as if reciting a prayer rather than sharing good news. The patrons congratulated him, but there was something in his eyes, distant, unfocused, that silenced the laughter before it could settle. Soon after, Elias and Jonah confirmed that their wives too were expecting, and that all three had conceived within days of one another. The timing was too exact to ignore, and in a town where coincidence was often mistaken for omen, people began to talk. Some said it was God's grace that finally touched the Whitlocks, while others whispered that something darker had found its way into their home. The family's estate sat several miles from the main road, hidden behind a curtain of oaks and willows that seemed to swallow sunlight whole. Few dared visit, though the brothers occasionally came into town for supplies, always together, always quiet, and never buying what one would expect for three growing pregnancies. There was no extra cloth for infant clothes, no milk or herbs for expectant mothers, only sacks of coarse salt, shovels, and kerosene. The preacher at Milford's chapel found it troubling and visited the Whitlocks to offer blessings, but he returned pale and shaken, refusing to speak of what he'd seen inside. He merely said that the house felt wrong, like the air had been drawn out of it. The town doctor also tried to visit after hearing the wives had not been seen in months, but he was turned away at the gate by Thomas, who said the women were resting and needed no interference. No one questioned him directly, for the Whitlocks were known to protect their privacy fiercely. Still, rumors began to take form, passed in murmurs across the church pews and whispered during late evening walks home. It wasn't just that all three wives were pregnant at the same time. It was that none of them were ever seen outside after the announcement. Curtains that once fluttered open during the day now remained closed. The chimney, which used to smoke steadily through winter, went cold, as if the fire inside had been extinguished. At night, farmers in the neighboring fields spoke of faint lamplight moving through the Whitlock windows long after midnight, sometimes flickering like it was being carried from room to room. Others claimed they heard what sounded like chanting, soft, measured, almost like lullabies sung backward. By spring, the story of the Whitlock pregnancies had become a quiet obsession for the people of Milford. Every family had its own version of what was happening behind those closed doors. Some said the brothers had made a pact with something unholy to ensure heirs for the family name. Others believed the women had been cursed, that whatever life grew inside them was not meant to be born in God's light. But no one dared approach the farmhouse again, for fear that whatever lingered there might follow them home through the mist. What had started as a celebration of new life was slowly turning into an omen, that the town would remember for generations, the first chapter in a story that no one wanted to believe was real, yet everyone knew would not end with birth. As the months drifted by, the Whitlock pregnancies became the town's most unsettling mystery. It wasn't just the strange coincidence of timing anymore. It was the way everything about those pregnancies seemed to mirror each other in unnatural harmony. The townsfolk who managed to catch glimpses of the Whitlock wives described them in nearly identical states, pale and swollen, their faces hollowed by exhaustion, but marked with an eerie calmness that didn't belong to women expecting their first children. They moved the same way slowly, as if guided by an unseen rhythm, and even when they smiled, their expressions carried the same strained, frozen quality, like they were forcing their faces to behave in ways their minds had forgotten. What disturbed people the most was how synchronized their conditions became. When one fell ill, the others did too, within hours. When one fainted, the rest were found weak and trembling, almost as though their bodies were connected by invisible threads pulling them in unison. The midwife in town, who had once tended to many families in Milford, was summoned early in the third month to examine one of the wives. She later told her sister that she felt something off about the air inside the Whitlock home, that the smell of iron lingered too strong, and that each of the three women sat in the parlor together, hands resting on their bellies, in perfect silence, their eyes fixed on her without blinking. She had gone there expecting to comfort three expectant mothers, but what she found instead felt ritualistic, like a scene rehearsed. When she placed her ear to one of their stomachs, she expected to hear a heartbeat, but what she heard was faint and irregular, like something shifting in the dark. She couldn't explain it, and when she asked to return for another visit, the Whitlock brothers declined. From then on, no one from the outside entered the house again. But people noticed patterns, the same eerie timing of every event that followed. The curtains would open at dawn in all three upstairs rooms at precisely the same minute and close together just after sunset. Lights would flicker through each window in unison, as though someone was pacing back and forth in each room with perfect synchronization. One of the Whitlock farmhands, who later quit and refused to go near the property again, said he once heard the wives humming together at night through the open window, the same lullaby repeated over and over in perfect harmony, their voices soft but unnervingly exact, without the slightest difference in pitch or tone. As the pregnancies progressed, the similarities only deepened. The townsfolk who dared to gossip said the women's bodies changed at the same rate, their bellies rounding identically, even their movements matching day to day. The few who had seen them described the same swollen hands, the same grayish tint beneath their eyes, and the same vacant stare when someone tried to speak to them. Some believed the brothers had forced them into some kind of unnatural ritual, binding them together through forbidden means. Others whispered that the women were no longer entirely human, that whatever had been conceived within them had begun to take control. By the 7th month, the Whitlock home had grown deathly silent. No laughter, no sounds of preparation for childbirth, just a stillness that seemed to thicken the air. The local doctor, who had once offered to help, said he could feel something unnatural whenever the wind blew from the direction of the Whitlock property. He claimed that even the animals avoided that part of the road, their behavior turning erratic near the fence line. Then came the nights when lights from within the house turned crimson, faint but unmistakable, glowing through the fog like coals buried under ash. People began to speak less of the pregnancies and more of what they feared was coming when the 9th month would finally arrive. Whatever grew inside those women wasn't following nature's path. It was following something older, something deliberate, and each passing day made it clearer that all three were not carrying children, but something born from the same unholy source. By the time the 6th month arrived, the tension around the Whitlock farmhouse had grown unbearable, pressing down on the town like a heavy mist that refused to lift. The wives had not been seen for weeks, and no one could say for certain if they were even alive inside those shuttered rooms. It was then that the midwife, a sturdy and devout woman named Martha Penwell, decided to defy the whispers and return to the property. She had been the one to first examine the women months ago, and ever since that visit, she had been haunted by what she'd heard. Faint movements that didn't sound like the stirring of unborn children, more like something slithering against the walls of flesh. The night she resolved to go back, She told her sister that she needed peace of mind, that she could no longer sleep with the sound of those whispers in her head. She arrived at the Whitlock house just after sunset, clutching her worn leather satchel and a small wooden cross. Thomas Whitlock greeted her at the door, his face pale, eyes sunken, and his voice unusually soft. He didn't invite her in at first, only stared at her as though debating whether to let her cross the threshold. When he finally stepped aside, the smell hit her immediately, a damp metallic odor that reminded her of rust and wet earth. The house was dimly lit, candles placed on every surface, their wax pooling like melted bone. She could hear movement upstairs, a slow dragging shuffle, and she assumed the wives were being kept in their rooms. Thomas led her to the parlor, where Elias and Jonah waited, sitting silently beside the cold fireplace. None of the men looked at her directly. Their hands were clasped tightly, knuckles white, as though restraining themselves from something. When Martha asked to see the wives, Thomas shook his head, but then, after a pause, gestured toward the staircase. She climbed alone, the boards creaking beneath her weight, the sound echoing through the hollow house. As she reached the landing, she heard something faint, soft crying, not of women, but something smaller, thinner, and far away, like the muffled sound of an infant's wail. The sound seemed to come from beneath her feet rather than from the rooms ahead. Her breath caught as she followed the noise toward the far end of the hallway. There were 3 closed doors, each marked with a small wooden carving above the frame, symbols she didn't recognize. The crying stopped when she reached the middle door. When she entered, she found one of the wives sitting upright in bed, her hands resting on her swollen stomach, eyes fixed on the far corner of the room. The other 2 wives were not there, but she could hear faint rustling through the adjoining walls. The woman did not respond when spoken to. Her lips trembled, but no sound came out. Then Martha noticed something horrifying. The sheets beneath her were damp, stained a dark brown, but there was no sign of delivery. The woman's belly shifted under her touch, not in kicks, but in slow, deliberate waves, like something was crawling just beneath the skin. Martha stumbled back, choking on her scream, and fled toward the stairs. Oh, that was when she heard it again, the crying, but louder this time, rising up through the floorboards. It wasn't coming from the rooms above. It was echoing from the cellar below. She stopped on the stairwell, listening, her hand pressed against the wall, and felt a faint vibration running through it, a rhythmic thumping that almost matched a heartbeat. The crying grew sharper, more desperate, and then was joined by another sound, a dragging, wet shuffle, followed by a whisper she swore was her own name. That was enough to shatter her resolve. She bolted down the stairs, past the 3 men who sat unmoving in the parlor, their eyes fixed on the floor as though they already knew what she had heard. She ran into the night without looking back, clutching her cross so tightly it cut into her palm. When she reached her home, she refused to speak of what she had seen, only repeating that the Whitlock house was wrong, that what she heard in that cellar was not meant for the world above. By morning, her hair had turned noticeably gray, and she left Milford entirely a week later, leaving behind a town that would never again look toward the Whitlock property without feeling the weight of something living beneath it. In the weeks following the midwife's flight from the Whitlock property, the town of Milford began to tremble beneath an invisible fear that no one could name aloud. People no longer used the road that passed by the Whitlock farm. Even travelers chose to take the longer forest route, unwilling to walk near that place where the air always felt colder. The Whitlock brothers stopped appearing in town altogether, and the church bells, which once called the community together every Sunday, tolled to emptier pews. The preacher, Reverend Alden Hurst, was among the few who refused to ignore what was happening. He was a stern man of Scripture, known for his steady voice and unwavering faith, and he could not accept the silence that had settled over his congregation. Rumors about the Whitlock's wives had reached his ears many times, growing more grotesque with each retelling. People whispered that the women were no longer human, that their bodies had been claimed by something unholy, and that the Whitlock men were keeping vigil not over life, but over something born of the grave. One evening, Reverend Hurst decided to visit the Whitlock house himself. He believed it was his duty to bring light to whatever darkness had taken root there, convinced that faith could still drive away whatever evil had crept into their walls. Before leaving, he told the church deacon that he would not stay the night, only long enough to pray for the family and speak words of deliverance. The sun was setting when he reached the property, casting long red shadows over the field. The Whitlock farmhouse stood still against the dimming sky, its windows sealed and its doors dusted with what looked like black ash. The preacher knocked 3 times, calling out to the brothers by name, but no voice answered. When he finally stepped inside, he found the front door unlocked, and the moment he crossed the threshold, the air grew thick, heavy with the same metallic tang the midwife had described before she vanished from town. The interior of the house looked abandoned, yet not empty. Candles burned low in nearly every corner, wax hardened in uneven drips like tears frozen mid-fall. The floor was layered with strange symbols drawn in chalk and smeared in places as though from bare feet. As he moved further in, he began to whisper prayers, but his own words sounded muffled, swallowed by the air. Somewhere deeper within, he heard faint murmurs, a kind of chanting that rose and fell in rhythm, followed by the soft sobbing of what sounded like a woman. When he turned toward the sound, he saw Thomas Whitlock standing in the hallway, his face streaked with soot, eyes hollow and feverish. Thomas said nothing, only raised a finger to his lips and gestured for silence before disappearing into the next room. Against his better judgment, Reverend Hurst followed. The room he entered was dimly lit, its windows covered with blankets, and in the center stood a wooden cradle. But there was no baby inside, only a tangle of bloodied linens and what looked like soil packed into the fabric. The preacher stumbled back, gasping as he realized the soil was moving ever so slightly, like something breathing beneath it. His instinct screamed to leave, yet his faith demanded that he speak. He opened his Bible, began reciting verses from the book of Matthew, but the words faltered when the murmuring returned, now surrounding him from all sides. The whispering grew clearer, overlapping voices repeating his name, each one carrying the same tone as the wives he had once baptized years ago. He fled from the room, running toward the doorway, but before he reached it, he felt a cold hand grasp his wrist. It was Elias Whitlock, his face expressionless, eyes unfocused, and when he spoke, his voice was not entirely his own. "Life born under false moons cannot be blessed," he said, repeating it as though reciting something memorized rather than understood. The preacher tore free and stumbled into the yard, gasping under the open sky. He did not look back. 2 days later, his body was found near the riverbank, his Bible torn to shreds beside him, and his right hand clutching a handful of wet soil that smelled faintly of blood. The townsfolk buried him quietly. No sermon, no hymns, just silence. From that day forward, no one dared speak openly of the Whitlocks again. The church doors remained closed for weeks, and those who had once mocked the old preacher's warnings now crossed themselves every time the wind carried a whisper from the woods. It was said that the ground near where his body was found never grew grass again, as if the earth itself refused to cover the mark of what he had seen that night. When the 9th month came, the people of Milford knew it before anyone said a word. The Whitlock property, silent for so long, began to change in ways that could be felt more than seen. The air grew heavier, thick with a smell like wet copper, and a strange haze lingered over the fields no matter the time of day. Dogs refused to go near the edge of the woods, howling toward the farmhouse as if warning something to stay inside. For weeks, no one had glimpsed the Whitlock brothers, and rumors of what was happening within those shuttered walls swelled with each passing night. Then, one cold dawn, a scream tore through the valley, a woman's voice, sharp and raw, echoing from the direction of the Whitlock home. It carried across the fog and fell silent as abruptly as it began. No one dared to investigate until the following afternoon when curiosity, or perhaps guilt, drove a small group of townsmen to the edge of the property. They found the front door unlatched, swinging slowly in the wind. Inside, the air was foul, thick with decay and iron. The men called out, but received no answer. When they entered the rooms, they found them empty, too empty. Furniture overturned, sheets torn from the beds, the smell of blood woven into the air so deeply it burned the throat. In the upstairs hallway, the wallpaper was smeared with dark stains, and one of the walls bore the imprint of a hand pressed so hard into the plaster it left an indentation. The rooms that had once belonged to the Whitlock wives were in shambles, the beds soaked through with crimson patches that had long dried, the pillows slashed open as though clawed by something desperate. But there were no bodies, no sign of the women at all. One of the men, a young farmer named Samuel Train, swore he heard soft crying coming from behind one of the walls. When they pressed their ears to it, they realized the sound was faintly rhythmic, almost like breathing, but deep within the structure itself, not from any living person. They tore open the paneling, but there was nothing inside, only a foul stench that made one of them vomit where he stood. As they continued their search, they found a trail of blood leading from the stairs to the window at the end of the hall. The glass was shattered from the inside, and smeared along the wooden frame were handprints, small, delicate, and lined with what looked like fingernail scratches etched deep into the wood. The prints were all facing inward, as if the women had been trying to keep something from getting out rather than escape themselves. Downstairs, the dining room table had been cleared except for 3 objects neatly placed in the center: a lock of hair tied with black ribbon, a rosary missing its cross, and what appeared to be a small shriveled umbilical cord wrapped in linen. The sight made one man faint, and the others carried him outside, too shaken to go any further. Before leaving, Samuel turned back one last time and noticed the cellar door slightly open, a faint draft of cold air rising from below. He took a single step toward it before something shifted in the darkness beneath the stairs, a slow scraping, like nails dragging across stone. That sound was enough. They fled the house without looking back. When word spread through Milford that the Whitlock women had vanished, the brothers gave their explanation 3 days later. They appeared at the edge of town, unshaven and pale, claiming that all 3 wives had died in childbirth. The townspeople asked to see the graves, but the brothers said the burials had been private, carried out on family land as per old Whitlock custom. Their eyes were blank, their voices flat, and when asked about the children, they simply said none had survived. After that day, no one ever saw the Whitlock brothers again. The farmhouse stood empty, its windows shattered, its door creaking endlessly in the wind. And though the town wished to forget, some said that on certain nights, when the fog crept over the fields and the moon burned red behind the clouds, faint crying could still be heard from the direction of the house, not the sound of grief, but the thin, brittle wailing of something newly born and already lost. After the Whitlock brothers appeared in town to announce the sudden deaths of their wives and the stillbirths of their children, the people of Milford were left in stunned silence. No one dared challenge them directly, but unease spread through the streets like a fever. The brothers spoke little, gave no details of how or when the deaths occurred, and their faces carried a strange calm that unsettled even the most sympathetic neighbors. They said the burials had already been done on the family's land, as was their custom, and that they wished to be left alone to mourn. But there were no funeral bells, no procession, and no priest summoned to bless the graves. Days passed, then weeks, and the Whitlock house remained dark. Smoke no longer rose from its chimney, and the livestock, once seen grazing near the barn, began to wander freely, untended. It was as if the brothers had buried more than their wives. They had buried themselves along with them. Soon, talk of the missing graves became impossible to avoid. A few townsmen, led by Samuel Train, the same man who had found the house in ruin, decided to look for proof. They went under the cover of night, fearful of being seen, though no one was left to stop them. The moon was high and sharp when they reached the property, the kind of cold light that made every shadow look alive. The ground was soft from recent rain, easy to dig, but no matter how many places they searched, behind the barn, near the willow trees, even by the small family chapel, they found nothing resembling a burial. There were no mounds of earth, no markers, not even disturbed soil. The only sign of recent activity was a wide circle of scorched grass behind the house, blackened as though by fire. At its center lay 3 rusted shovels driven upright into the dirt, their handles bound together by what looked like woven strands of human hair. By morning, word of the discovery had spread, and fear overtook curiosity. The preacher's replacement refused to visit the Whitlock land, calling it a place sealed by sin. The town sheriff made a brief attempt to investigate but never returned to the property after finding the family barn filled with dozens of small animal carcasses arranged in careful rows, each with a faint symbol carved into its chest. Whatever the Whitlocks had been doing before their disappearance, it had gone far beyond mourning. The few who had known them personally recalled how each brother seemed haunted in his final days in town. Jonah, the youngest, was seen standing outside the general store one evening, muttering under his breath and staring at nothing. When approached, he simply said, "They aren't gone," before walking off into the fog. That was the last time anyone saw him alive. Not long after, lights began to flicker again in the upper windows of the farmhouse, though no one lived there anymore. At first, the townsfolk thought it might be trespassers or pranksters, but those who ventured close enough to see swore the light wasn't ET from candles or lanterns. It pulsed faintly, as though breathing. A traveling peddler who passed through the area claimed he saw figures moving behind the curtains, 3 silhouettes that matched the height and shape of the Whitlock wives. He said they appeared to be swaying in unison, heads tilted slightly, as though listening to something. The town dismissed it as superstition, but no one could explain the echoing sound that began to drift through the valley on windless nights. A rhythmic noise like the slow turning of soil. Then came the final sign. A farmer living near the river woke one morning to find his field littered with feathers and broken twigs, as though a storm had torn through only his land. In the mud near his fence were deep footprints, not quite human, but unmistakably formed by something walking upright. They led straight from the direction of the Whitlock property and vanished into the woods. When Samuel Train returned one last time to search for answers, he found the farmhouse door wide open and the faint smell of decay spilling into the air. On the wall beside the entryway, someone had scrawled a single phrase in what looked like dried blood: "We kept our word." From that day on, the Whitlock land was abandoned. The house was left to rot and sink into the soil, a silent monument to a family that had lied not only to the town, but perhaps to life itself. Months turned into years, and though the Whitlock house stood empty, the memory of what had happened there never loosened its grip on Milford. People avoided the property altogether, taking long detours to keep from passing its overgrown gates. Nature itself seemed reluctant to reclaim it. The grass grew in uneven patches. The trees near the house twisted unnaturally, their bark blackened as if scorched from the inside. The silence that lingered over that stretch of land was oppressive, heavy with a tension that felt almost watchful. But one thing disturbed that silence: the footprints. They first appeared a year after the brothers vanished, during a particularly cold winter when the ground froze hard. A group of hunters returning from the woods found a line of small prints in the snow behind the old Whitlock barn. They looked like those of an infant, the shape of tiny toes pressed clearly into the frost, yet they were too deep and perfectly spaced, as if whatever made them walked with intention. The men followed the trail for half a mile until it stopped abruptly by the riverbank. The last print sunk halfway into the ice. There were no other tracks leading away, no signs of struggle, no explanation for how they began or ended. When the hunters told their story in town, few believed them outright, but fear began to take hold again. The prints returned every few months, always around the same time, the night of a full moon. Each time they appeared, they were found in the same pattern, starting near the farmhouse and weaving through the dead field toward the river before looping back. The size of the prints never changed, as if the creature or whatever it was had never grown older. Some of the older townsfolk claimed it was the souls of the unborn Whitlock children, cursed to wander between the house and the water, searching for the mothers they were denied. Others believed it was a sign that the Whitlock bloodline had not truly ended, that something born in secret still lingered in the dark corners of the land. Eventually, a few brave souls decided to see for themselves. Samuel Train's son, Elijah, was among them. By then, decades had passed, and the house had decayed into a skeleton of its former self. Its roof sagged, windows shattered, vines crawling through what was left of the walls. On a summer night when the full moon hung low and red, Elijah and 2 others set out to catch whatever was making those footprints. They waited in the field until the air grew cold and the frogs stopped croaking. Just before midnight, they heard it. a soft squelching sound, like wet feet pressing against the mud. They turned their lanterns toward the noise and saw the impressions forming one by one across the ground, yet nothing visible made them. The grass bent and lifted, the earth shifting as if under invisible weight. Then the lantern flame flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. What happened next was never clear. Elijah stumbled back into town hours later, covered in mud and shaking violently, unable to speak for days. When he finally did, his story made even the skeptics tremble. He claimed he had seen shapes in the fog, not of children, but of things that moved like them, small bodies crawling, heads tilted unnaturally, faces pale and eyeless, with mouths that opened too wide when they breathed. They had followed him all the way to the edge of the woods before vanishing with the dawn. The other two men were never found. Their lanterns were discovered days later at the riverbank, still upright and unbroken, the mud around them marked by dozens of tiny footprints circling over and over in the same spot. After that night, the people of Milford stopped speaking of the Whitlocks altogether. They closed the churchyard that faced the eastern hills and forbade children from going near the river after dark. Yet even in silence, the legend endured. On certain nights when the moonlight turns the mist silver, those who live closest to the old fields say they can still hear faint footsteps in the frost. Light, deliberate and endless, pacing the same path between the farmhouse ruins and the cold whisper of the water, as if something that was never born refuses to stop walking. Decades passed, and the Whitlock house, long abandoned, had almost completely succumbed to time. Its roof sagged into itself. The walls were riddled with gaps where weather and rot had torn through, and the windows gaped like hollow eyes staring into the overgrown fields. Nature had reclaimed much of the property, yet the house still exuded a presence that no one could ignore. Local farmers avoided it, even in daylight, and the few curious travelers who dared approach spoke of a coldness that seemed to cling to the air, a shiver that rose from the soil itself. It was during the demolition of the remaining structure, intended to clear the land for a new road, that the full horror of what had transpired inside was discovered. Workers began tearing through the last standing walls, expecting only rotted wood and decades of debris. What they found instead was something that would haunt the town's memory for generations. Beneath the floorboards of the main parlor, they uncovered a hidden cavity, meticulously constructed and sealed so perfectly it had gone unnoticed by anyone entering the house in the years prior. Inside were dozens of tiny skeletons carefully arranged, each so small that it was impossible to tell their age at death. Yet each bore features of fully formed teeth, sharp and unnaturally precise, like they had lived longer than their bodies suggested. The workmen recoiled, some vomiting where they stood, unable to comprehend how such a collection of remains had remained hidden for so long. The discovery was reported immediately, and authorities came to examine the site, but even they were unsettled by the arrangement of the bones. They were not scattered in chaos as one might expect of burial. Instead, the skeletons were positioned upright, arms crossed or hands resting over their knees, as though sitting in meditation or waiting for something. The teeth, fully developed, contradicted the size of the skulls, and the bone structure suggested an unnatural growth pattern, almost as if time itself had twisted the development of these children. No records of the Whitlock pregnancies indicated live births, yet here were remains that told a story far darker than anyone had imagined. Investigators attempted to trace the lineage of the Whitlocks, but records were incomplete, and family histories were intentionally vague. Oral accounts told of the 3 wives who disappeared, of the brothers who vanished, and of the strange occurrences that had plagued the land long after the house was abandoned. Those who had lived through the events whispered of cries in the night, footprints in the frost, and the uncanny feeling of being watched near the property. Now, decades later, the skeletal remains provided a grim confirmation that something unnatural had persisted in that home, something that had eluded explanation for generations. Experts suggested that the bones' anomalies might point to a ritual, perhaps one intended to preserve life in a twisted form, or to create life that could not exist outside the house. No one could agree, and no one dared linger near the site long enough to uncover more than what had already been revealed. Word of the discovery spread quickly through the region. Families who had avoided the property for years began to recall the stories their elders had told, the accounts that had always seemed exaggerated, now backed by undeniable evidence. Yet the true terror remained unspoken. The children had never lived, yet they were somehow fully formed in ways that defied nature. The implication hung over the town like a shadow that the Whitlocks had been involved in something ancient and malevolent, a secret buried beneath generations of silence. The house was eventually leveled completely, the soil removed and burned in an attempt to erase the curse. But the fields retained a certain stillness, an unnatural quiet that reminded everyone the land had been touched by something far beyond human comprehension. Even today, those who walk the old roads swear they can feel tiny footsteps brushing the edge of their awareness, a reminder that what was hidden can never truly be buried. And the Whitlocks' story lingers like a whisper, waiting for the next curious soul to stumble upon the echoes of that sinister past. So if you found this tale chilling and want more stories like it, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.